Good afternoon, everyone, and it's an honor to be here. And I'm looking forward to a robust and open discussion. Allow me to set a few framing remarks so that you understand where I'm coming from. I hope most of you are familiar with Singapore. It's this tiny city-state, cosmopolitan, multiracial, multilingual, in the heart of Southeast Asia. One way I explain it to New Yorkers is imagine if upstate New York ejected Manhattan and told Manhattan, you now have to be an independent state and have your own Army, Navy, Air Force, run your own energy policy, your own food security, and the rest of it. So Singapore always looks at the world from a position of acute vulnerability. But let me first zoom out to Southeast Asia and to give you some idea of both the growth potential of Southeast Asia and the equities which the United States has in Southeast Asia. So first, population. In Southeast Asia, it's about 661 million people. That's a population somewhat larger than the EU. The combined GDP is only 3 trillion US dollars. And I say only because, in fact, we expect that number to double, if not quadruple, over the next 2 decades. And if that happens, that would make ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the 4th largest economy in the world. And therefore, if you believe that we're moving into a multipolar world, it means Southeast Asia will be one of those 10 poles of a multipolar world. Our population in Southeast Asia is still young. 60% of our people are below the age of 35. And what this means is that there is a demographic dividend to be harvested and the tremendous economic potential if, and this is a big if things go right. So today, ASEAN is the 5th largest economy in the world and the 4th largest goods export market for the US. That's after Canada, Mexico, and China. And US trade with Southeast Asia supports more than 500,000 American jobs. I need to insert this line, and every time I met President Trump, and even now President Biden, I remind them that there are jobs, American jobs, at stake in Southeast Asia. In fact, the US has more invested in Southeast Asia than it has invested in China, India, and Japan combined. This is often a surprising thing to most people, that the US has more FDI invested in Southeast Asia than it has invested in China, India, and Japan combined. And the other coda to this line is that the bulk of these investments are actually in Singapore. In 2021 alone, and this is in the depths of COVID, US investment flows into Southeast Asia total 40 billion US dollars. In fact, that is a 41% year-on-year increase and more than mainland China, which I think came in at about US $14 billion, or Japan at $12 billion, and the Netherlands at $11 billion combined. So in a very real sense, the future of Southeast Asia is bright, but the point I'm trying to make is look at us, Southeast Asia, on our own merits, and not simply through a US versus China lens. The second and often underappreciated point is the role that a strong, enduring US presence has played in creating the conditions that enable peace and prosperity in our part of the world. Our view is that America has been, for decades, a benign and constructive presence. Post-World War II, it was the American vision of a new world order and underwritten with American blood and treasure that created a system of based on liberal economic principles and free and open trade and global supply chains that enable many countries in Asia, and especially tiny city-states like Singapore, to industrialize and to surf on the emerging waves of globalization, to access critical markets, to access new and emerging technologies, and to be part of a global network of supply chains. This was if you think back over especially the last 5-6 decades, this was a key engine for growth in my part of the world. So Singapore and the other so-called Asian tigers were major beneficiaries of Pax Americana. And what we experienced, therefore, was a stable business and political environment, and one in which a hardworking and disciplined people could take full advantage of. We had thousands of multinational companies set up base in Southeast Asia and in Singapore in order to access this globalization. And again, if you think back 4 or 5 decades, this was probably before the word globalization was popularized. Another sub-factor to this is that there was a Cold War. And during that phase in which the Cold War was coldest, or you could say hottest, depending on how you want to define it. But during that time, and so I'm referring to the time in the 60s and the 70s especially, at that time, the U.S. security presence in Asia, both in Korea and in Vietnam, in fact, bought us time and space to prove that free market economics and globalization works, and we were beneficiaries. And again, if you cast your mind back 50 years ago, this was at a time when it was not yet obvious that communism was dead. So, as luck would have it, we were on the right side, and America played an appropriate role. And just from a Singapore perspective, let's put some numbers on this. When we were forced to go independent in 1965, our per capita GDP was about US $500. Today, it is more than US $50,000. It's a once-in-a-lifetime leap. But the point I'm making is that this was a leap which was possible because of the geostrategic economic circumstances of the last 5 decades. Today, there are close to 5,500 American companies in Singapore alone, with a cumulative FDI stock amounting to US $372 billion. And Singapore, in return, is also the second largest Asian investor in the United States. And we have, I think, investment stock of about 62.5 billion US dollars. So the point is, it flows 2 ways. Now, having put the historical context for this, what about the future? And, you know, a few years ago, there was this people who would like to talk about an Asian century or a Pacific century. And they were referring to what was conceived as a period of great opportunity. But obviously, things don't always go according to plan. And when you've got great opportunity, you also have great potential dangers emerging. Since my last address here, the world, quite frankly, has entered a far more challenging, uncertain, and dangerous phase. What we witness today is a global order under full frontal assault. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a full frontal assault on the UN Charter, on a formula which has enabled generally peace, order, security, and prosperity for decades. COVID-19 And also as a result of the war in Europe now, we have seen persistent supply chain disruptions. You know, supply chains, for those of you who are in business, we used to pride ourselves on delivering things just in time and keeping warehouses as small and as empty as possible. COVID-19 suddenly reminded everyone you needed to organize things on just in case. And just in time did not buy you resilience. We're also witnessing a period of prolonged and record inflation. We don't think this is going to be solved in the near future. And on top of that, you've got a food and energy crisis as well. So this is a perfect long storm that we're confronting. Needless to say, it has caused great anxiety in the domestic politics all over the world. And obviously, the complicated and difficult relationship between the United States and China adds another layer of complexity, risk, and danger to this perfect long storm. I have been a regular visitor to Washington now over the past 7-8 years, and even before that. And I don't think I'm the only observer who will have concluded that sentiments within the United States against China have hardened, and have hardened considerably. Perhaps it's the emergence of a peer competitor for the first time in American history, a peer competitor capable of competing in all dimensions. And this has crystallized a bipartisan conviction or anxiety that China could pose the United States' biggest strategic threat. And if so, needs to be countered by all means available. And this is also animated by differences in values, ideologies, systems of governance, and worldviews. And sometimes actually it's a deeper anxiety about the future. And very often you think about it, external anxieties are really also reflections of internal anxieties about the strength, the cohesion, and the optimism of our own domestic societies. Now, within China, and I've obviously been a regular visitor to China, during the last 1 year, I think I've been there 4 times. So I can, this is not just hearsay, but direct observation. In China, attitudes have become more assertive. And as China's strategic and economic influence has grown, so has their sense of vulnerability. And there is a strong and emerging sense of nationalism in China. And, it's not only so-called democracies that have domestic politics. Communist regimes also have domestic politics. And leaders there also have to respond to the anxieties and the zeitgeist of their own societies. So we've all witnessed a China that has become more muscular in defending its interests. It has taken a more active international stance in the belief that its time has come and it wants to assume its rightful place in the world order. Actually, the key missing ingredient in this relationship, from the perspective of a dispassionate third country, is that there's a lack of strategic trust between the United States and China. And just as in human relationships, when trust is absent, there is a danger of always assuming the worst about the counterparty. And the danger then is that you end up in a potentially escalatory spiral. Actions and words by one party, reactions and counter responses by the other party. And this raises the prospect of miscalculations or mishaps. And I think the ultimate focal point for this is the Taiwan Straits, which is the reddest of red lines for Beijing. I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi was here yesterday, and I'm sure you got a direct download from him about how critical this area is. So the U.S. China rivalry inevitably affects all of us, and especially for those of us in Asia. And if you look at Southeast Asia, you will understand that it is natural for some countries to be closer to one side or the other. If you draw a spectrum with China and the US, and then you line up all the countries in Asia and Southeast Asia, exactly where they stand will be a spectrum. But actually, nobody wants to be trapped at the extreme ends of both spectrums. Nobody wants to be forced to make invidious choices. Nobody wants to become a vassal state or a cat's paw or a stalking horse or whichever metaphor you use. And there can be no good outcome for us in Asia if our countries are forced into two camps with a line in between. In our view, a more stable and a less tense and a constructive configuration is for both China and the US to have overlapping circles of friends. So I want to emphasize this metaphor. Overlapping circles of friends rather than a hard line or a new wall and a Cold War or even greater danger ahead. So just keep this idea of overlapping circles of friends. And it is our hope that this would be a configuration which would be more stable, more durable, more peaceful, and offer more prosperity for all of us in Asia. So amidst these geostrategic rivalries, we now find ourselves at an inflection point. Because quite apart from geostrategic, we have now reached a point, and here I speak as a scientist, we've reached a point at which fundamental breakthroughs in basic research and applied science have led us to the cusp of an era where we are witnessing a digital revolution, an energy transformation, the onset and proliferation of artificial intelligence, robotics, and synthetic biology. In fact, we've seen all these elements even during COVID-19 and over the last few years. But the point is, all these revolutions are interlocking and setting up a virtuous cycle in which I think we will see an accelerated new industrial revolution, which is completely upending the means of production and will have profound political and social impacts on our societies. So the point is this, and I want to end on an optimistic note. If we can avoid war, and if we can continue to work together on that same shared technological stack, we in fact have the potential to be at the era of a new golden age. And a golden age in which America, China, Europe, Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America can all partake on a new age of prosperity. It will require domestic reform. It will require investments in domestic infrastructure, in education, in training, investments in people, building up social capital, equity, and by building domestic confidence, I believe it will also help diffuse some of the tensions as far as foreign policy is concerned. I'm a believer that foreign policy begins at home. So anyway, I'm trying to end on a note of optimism, that we can get through the next, I think, the next 2 years are absolutely critical on the global stage. If we can get through these next 2 years, not lose our heads and not lose hope, and continue to invest in our own people, we in fact have the prospect of many great decades ahead of us. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions and a completely open and robust discussion. Thank you all very much.